At 06:15 hours on May 10, 1945, Oberleutnant Heinz Schäffer stood in the conning tower of U-977, watching 16 of his men climb into rubber dinghies off the coast of Holsnøy Island, Norway. They were the married men, the ones with families waiting back home. Schäffer had given them a choice 5 days earlier when Germany surrendered. Come with him on a voyage that would probably end in death or captivity, or go home now to whatever fate awaited defeated German soldiers. 16 chose home, 32 chose to stay. What those 32 men didn't fully understand was that they had just volunteered for what Schäffer would later claim was a 66-day submerged voyage. Whether they truly stayed underwater that long or surfaced regularly, as American interrogators believed, they were about to attempt the impossible. A steel coffin running mostly on its snorkel beneath the Atlantic while every Allied warship and aircraft in the ocean hunted for them. Schäffer was 24 years old. He had taken command of U-977 in December 1944. Born in Berlin on April 28, 1921, he had joined the Kriegsmarine in 1939 as an 18-year-old. He'd served on U-561 and then U-445 as watch officer, completing 4 war patrols, including one to the Gulf of Guinea. He'd seen the evolution of the U-boat war from German dominance to Allied supremacy. He'd watched friends die. He'd earned the Iron Cross First and Second Class, the U-boat war badge, but he'd never commanded a submarine on a war patrol. His previous command, U-148, had been a small Type IID training boat in the Baltic. Now he commanded a Type VIIC that had been relegated to training after being rammed 3 times, her pressure hull compromised, her batteries at 70% efficiency. The problem wasn't just the distance, it was the timing. Germany had surrendered on May 8, 1945. Every U-boat at sea had been ordered by Admiral Karl Dönitz to surface, report their position, and proceed to the nearest Allied port for surrender. Most did. By May 10th, 156 U-boats had already surrendered. Their crews were being processed as prisoners of war, but Schäffer had heard the propaganda broadcasts. Joseph Goebbels had spent months telling the German people what would happen after defeat. The Morgenthau Plan would turn Germany into a goat pasture. Every German male would be enslaved and sterilized. The victors would destroy German culture, German industry, German identity. Schäffer didn't know if the propaganda was true, but he remembered what happened to German prisoners after the First World War. His father had been captured in 1918. He didn't come home until 1920, 2 years in a French prison camp, 2 years of starvation, rations and forced labor. And that was after a war. Germany had lost with honor, not after the discoveries the Allies were making in places like Bergen-Belsen and Dachau. The submarine had left Kristiansand on May 2nd for what was supposed to be U-977's first combat patrol. After 2 years as a training boat, she was finally going to war. Schäffer's orders were to enter Southampton harbour and attack British shipping. It was a suicide mission. Southampton was one of the most heavily defended ports in Britain. A Type 7 submarine trying to penetrate those defences in May 1945 had virtually no chance of survival. The British had radar, sonar, hundreds of escort vessels, and complete air superiority. They had been hunting U-boats for 6 years. They knew every trick, every tactic, every weakness. But Schäffer never had to attempt the mission. On May 5th, while U-977 was north of Scotland, Admiral Dönitz ordered all submarines to cease offensive operations. 3 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. Schäffer received the surrender order on May 8 through the submarine's radio. The message was clear. Surface immediately. Report position. Proceed to the nearest Allied port. Destroy all secret materials. Do not scuttle your vessel. Most U-boat commanders followed the orders immediately. They had fought their war. They had done their duty. Now it was time to go home, even if home meant a prison camp. But Schäffer gathered his crew in the submarine's control room on the evening of May 8th. The air was thick with diesel fumes and the smell of 48 unwashed men. The submarine was running on the surface in heavy seas. Most of the crew were boys, 18, 19 years old. They had joined the Kriegsmarine expecting glory. Now they faced imprisonment, or worse. Schäffer told them they had three options. They could follow orders and surrender to the British. They could try to reach Spain, which was still neutral, and be interned there. Or they could attempt something that had never been done before. They could try to reach Argentina. Argentina was technically neutral but sympathetic to Germany. Buenos Aires had a large German community, almost 300,000 people. The Argentine government had only declared war on Germany under American pressure in March 1945, just weeks before the war ended. It was a paper declaration. No Argentine forces ever fought German forces. If they could reach Argentina, they might be interned rather than imprisoned. They might even be allowed to stay, to start new lives in South America. The crew voted. It wasn't unanimous, but the majority chose Argentina. The married men asked to be put ashore. They had wives, children. They couldn't abandon them for a voyage that might take months if it succeeded at all. Schäffer agreed. On May 10th, U-977 surfaced near Holsinoy Island. 16 men climbed into rubber dinghies and paddled toward shore. They would all be captured by British forces within days. That left 32 men aboard U-977. One officer, Schäffer. 5 petty officers. 26 enlisted sailors. The youngest was 17. The oldest was 28. None of them had ever made a patrol longer than 2 weeks. Now they were attempting to sail 7,644 nautical miles to Argentina while being hunted by every Allied force in the Atlantic. According to the American interrogation report, of these 32 men, 28 would participate in the traditional Neptune ceremony when crossing the equator. 4 had crossed before. These were young men, most barely out of their teens. They came from all over Germany, Bavaria, Prussia, Saxony, the Rhineland, farm boys and factory workers. Students who had left school to join the Kriegsmarine. They had signed up for glory and adventure. Now they were fugitives. The decision to flee hadn't been easy. Schäffer later told interrogators that his main reason was propaganda. Goebbels had broadcast that the Allies' Morgenthau plan would turn Germany into a goat pasture. Every German male would be enslaved and sterilized. But there were other factors. The poor treatment of German prisoners after World War I, the hope that Argentina, with its large German community of 300,000, would be more welcoming, and fear. Simple fear of what would happen to them as prisoners of the vengeful Allies. The first problem was fuel. U-977 carried 67 tons of diesel fuel when fully loaded. At economical cruising speed, running one engine at slow speed, she could travel about 9,000 nautical miles. That seemed like enough to reach Argentina with fuel to spare. But that calculation assumed surface running. Submerged, running on electric motors, the submarine's range dropped dramatically. And if they had to use their snorkel, running the diesels underwater, fuel consumption increased by 40% because of the back pressure on the exhaust system. The snorkel was their lifeline and their curse. The device had been invented by the Dutch before the war. The Germans had captured Dutch submarines in 1940 and adapted the technology for their own boats. It was essentially a pipe that could be raised above the surface while the submarine remained submerged, allowing the diesel engines to breathe. U-977 had been fitted with a snorkel in February 1945 during her last refit in Hamburg. The Type VIIC submarine was the workhorse of the German U-boat fleet. 703 were built during the war. They measured 67.1 meters long, 6.2 meters wide. On the surface, they could make 17.7 knots. Submerged on batteries, only 7.6 knots. With the snorkel, maximum speed dropped to 6 knots. The submarine carried 14 torpedoes, 5 torpedo tubes, 4 in the bow, 1 in the stern. An 88mm deck gun for surface engagements. Anti-aircraft weapons on the conning tower. But U-977 still carried all her weapons when she surrendered, proof she had never fired in anger. But the snorkel had problems. It could only be used in relatively calm seas. In rough weather, waves would close the float valve at the top of the snorkel tube, cutting off air to the engines. When that happened, the engines would suck air from inside the submarine, creating a partial vacuum that ruptured eardrums and made it impossible to breathe. The crew called it snorkel torture. The snorkel also limited speed. Maximum snorkel speed was 6 knots. Any faster, and the tube would create so much wake it would snap off. 6 knots meant it would take at least 45 days to cross the Atlantic if they could run continuously. But they couldn't run continuously. They would have to stop to fix mechanical problems, to rest the crew, to navigate. And they would be hunted the entire time. The Allies had divided the Atlantic into grid squares. Every square was patrolled by aircraft and warships. The British and Americans had developed new detection technologies during the war, radar that could spot a snorkel head from 10 miles away. The snorkel itself left a visible exhaust plume that could be seen from 4.5 kilometers, magnetic anomaly detectors that could sense a submerged submarine from the air, radio direction finders that could pinpoint any transmission, sonobuoys dropped from aircraft to listen for submarine engines. The Atlantic had become a killing field for U-boats. In the last 4 months of the war, the Kriegsmarine had lost 120 submarines. The life expectancy of a U-boat on patrol was less than 2 missions. The statistics were terrifying. Of 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, 30,000 had died, 3 out of 4. The highest casualty rate of any service branch in any military during World War II. And now Schäffer was taking 32 men into that killing field after the war was over, when any Allied vessel that spotted them would assume they were pirates or war criminals and attack without warning. Schäffer knew the odds. He had been in the submarine force since 1941. He had served as watch officer on U-445 during 4 patrols in the Atlantic. He had seen the evolution of Allied anti-submarine warfare. In 1941, a U-boat could operate on the surface at night with relative safety. By 1943, radar-equipped aircraft were attacking submarines in total darkness. By 1945, U-boats were being hunted by coordinated groups of destroyers, corvettes, and escort carriers using tactics developed over 6 years of war. The second problem was the crew's mental state. Submarine warfare was psychological warfare. Men trapped in a steel tube 220 feet long and 20 feet wide, no privacy, no space, air that stank of diesel, sweat, and human waste. The constant fear of depth charges, the knowledge that if something went wrong at depth, there was no escape. German submariners had the highest casualty rate of any service branch. Of 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, 30,000 died, 3 out of 4. Those weren't statistics that inspired confidence. And now Schäffer was asking his crew to spend months submerged, breathing recycled air, living on canned food, never seeing the Sunday. On the morning of May 10th, after putting the married men ashore, U-977 submerged and headed west into the North Atlantic. Schäffer had made his decision. They would run submerged during daylight, using the snorkel. They would only surface at night, and only when absolutely necessary. They would maintain radio silence. To the rest of the world, U-977 would simply disappear. The first week was manageable. The crew was still fresh. Morale was reasonable. They were in familiar waters, the North Atlantic between Scotland and Iceland. Schäffer had sailed these waters before. He knew the currents, the weather patterns, the patrol routes. He kept the submarine at snorkel depth during the day, about 40 feet, and ran on one diesel engine to conserve fuel. At night, if conditions were safe, he would surface briefly to ventilate the boat and charge batteries. But by the second week, problems started. The snorkel float valve began sticking. Every time it stuck closed, the engines would suck air from inside the submarine. Men would collapse as the pressure dropped. Ears would bleed. The chief engineer, a petty officer, had to climb into the snorkel housing every few hours to manually free the valve. It was dangerous work. One mistake, and he would be crushed when the snorkel was lowered. The submarine's batteries were deteriorating faster than expected. They were old, worn from 2 years of training, exercises. Schäffer had requested new batteries in Hamburg, but there were none available. Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing. Now those worn batteries had to power the submarine's electric motors whenever the snorkel couldn't be used. In rough seas, which were common in the North Atlantic in May, they might have to run submerged on batteries for 12 hours or more. By the third week, the crew was showing signs of strain. Living at snorkel depth meant constant motion. The submarine rolled and pitched with every wave. Men couldn't sleep. They couldn't eat without vomiting. The junior sailors, teenagers who had never been to sea before joining the Kriegsmarine, were suffering the most. One boy, 17 years old, from Munich, started showing signs of what the crew called U-boat psychosis. He would stare at the hull, convinced he could hear water leaking in. He would count rivets obsessively. He stopped eating. Schäffer had to maintain discipline without the traditional tools of military command. What authority did he have now? Germany had surrendered. The Kriegsmarine no longer existed. He was asking these men to follow him based on nothing more than personal loyalty and the hope of a better fate in Argentina than in a British prison camp. When a 19-year-old mechanic refused to stand watch, claiming illness, Schäffer couldn't threaten him with court-martial. He could only appeal to crew solidarity. They would all make it, or none of them would. The North Atlantic was the most dangerous part of the voyage. This was where Allied anti-submarine forces were concentrated. Every day they heard warships passing overhead. The sound of propellers transmitted through the water. Destroyers moving at high speed. Slow merchant vessels in convoy. Several times aircraft flew directly over their position. The crew would hold their breath, waiting for the splash of depth charges. But they never came. The Allies were looking for submarines trying to attack convoys or reach Norwegian ports. They weren't looking for a submarine heading south toward the equator. On May 23rd, they detected a large formation of warships heading east. Schäffer counted at least 12 sets of propellers, probably a convoy returning to Britain after delivering supplies to the continent. The submarine went deep, 200 feet, and ran silent on electric motors. The convoy passed directly overhead. The hull groaned from the pressure. Paint flaked off the bulkheads, but they weren't detected. By the fourth week, hygiene had become critical. 48 men had used the submarine's 2 toilets continuously for a month. The toilets, which had to be pumped out through a complex valve system, frequently backed up. The smell was overwhelming. Fresh water was rationed to 1 cup per man per day for drinking. There was no water for washing. Men developed rashes, boils, fungal infections. The submarine's small medical kit had run out of basic supplies. The medic, a 22-year-old from Hamburg, was treating infections with engine grease because it was the only antiseptic left. Food was another problem. U-boats carried mostly canned goods. Canned bread, canned meat, canned vegetables. After a month at sea, everything tasted the same. The cook, trying to maintain morale, would give different names to the same meal. Monday was Atlantic stew. Tuesday was Neptune's feast. It was all the same grey meat in the same grey sauce. Fresh food had run out in the first week. The only variation was sauerkraut, which the crew ate to prevent scurvy. On June 1st, 22 days after leaving Norway, Schäffer made a decision that could have ended their voyage. The snorkel head was vibrating badly. If it broke off, they would have no way to run the diesels submerged. They would have to surface to charge batteries and ventilate, making them visible to any passing aircraft or ship. The problem had to be fixed. Schäffer surfaced the submarine at 2 a.m. in heavy fog. It was the first time they had fully surfaced in 2 weeks. The crew who went topside couldn't believe the sensation of fresh air. Some of them vomited from the sudden change in air pressure. Others just stood there, breathing deeply, feeling rain on their faces for the first time in weeks. Mueller and 2 mechanics worked on the snorkel for 3 hours. They found the problem, a cracked weld where the snorkel tube joined the housing. They patched it with metal strips cut from food cans and sealed with tar from the battery compartment. It was crude, but it held. As dawn approached, U-977 submerged again and continued south. By the 5th week, maintaining course was becoming difficult. The submarine's magnetic compass was unreliable because of the metal hull. The gyro compass needed regular adjustment. Schäffer could only take sun sightings through the periscope during the brief moments when they were at shallow depth and the weather was clear. He was navigating largely by dead reckoning, estimating their position based on speed and elapsed time. A small error could put them hundreds of miles off course. On June 12th, they passed west of the Azores. This was a milestone. They were out of the primary Allied patrol zones. The danger wasn't over, but it was reduced. Schäffer allowed the crew a small celebration, an extra ration of canned peaches, a few bottles of beer that had been hidden in the torpedo room. For a few hours, morale improved. But the worst was still ahead. As they moved south toward the equator, temperatures inside the submarine began rising. The Atlantic in June was warm. At snorkel depth, water temperature was 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the submarine, with no ventilation and 48 human bodies generating heat, temperatures reached 95 degrees. The engine room, where the diesels ran continuously, reached 110 degrees. Men were passing out from heat exhaustion. The medic was treating 2 or 3 cases a day. The humidity was unbearable. Everything was wet. Clothes never dried. Bedding grew mold. Books fell apart. Metal surfaces rusted despite constant maintenance. The electrical systems began shorting out from moisture. The radio, which they weren't using anyway, died completely. Several lighting circuits failed, plunging sections of the submarine into darkness. On June 20th, 41 days into the voyage, they faced their first real crisis. The port diesel engine seized. The chief engineer investigated and found the problem. Salt water had leaked into the lubrication system through a corroded gasket. The engine bearings were destroyed. Without spare parts, which they didn't have, the engine was useless. They would have to continue on one engine, cutting their speed and increasing their fuel consumption. Schäffer calculated their remaining fuel. With one engine, running at the most economical speed, they might have enough to reach Argentina. Maybe. If weather was good. If nothing else broke. If they didn't have to run submerged on batteries too often. It would be close. Very close. Morale collapsed. The crew knew what losing an engine meant. If the other engine failed, they were dead. They couldn't surface and surrender now, even if they wanted to. They had been running silent for 40 days. The Allies would assume they were a German submarine that had refused to surrender. They would be attacked immediately. Their only option was to continue. On June 25th, they crossed the Tropic of Cancer. They were in tropical waters now. The heat was killing them. Men lay in their bunks, barely able to move. The cook stopped preparing hot meals because lighting the galley stove would raise the temperature even more. They ate cold canned food. They drank warm water that tasted of metal and oil. Several men developed symptoms of scurvy despite the sauerkraut. Their gums bled. Their teeth loosened. Then came the event that nearly ended everything. On July 4th, 56 days into the voyage, the remaining diesel engine started overheating. The chief engineer found the problem immediately. The cooling water intake was partially blocked with seaweed and barnacles. To clear it, someone would have to go outside the pressure hull while submerged and manually clean the intake grate. It was insanity, but it was their only option. The engineer volunteered. Using the submarine's escape hatch, he locked himself in the escape chamber, flooded it, and opened the outer hatch. Working in total darkness at 40 feet depth, holding his breath, he cleared the intake grate with a steel bar. It took him 4 attempts, 4 trips outside the hull. On the last trip, he nearly drowned. The crew pulled him back inside unconscious. The medic managed to revive him. The engine was saved. On July 14th, after 66 days submerged, Schäffer made a decision that violated every principle of submarine warfare. He surfaced in daylight. They were approximately 600 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands. The crew was dying. Not metaphorically, actually dying. 2 men were comatose from heat exhaustion. Others were showing signs of severe psychological breakdown. One sailor had tried to open the torpedo tube from inside, attempting suicide. They couldn't continue submerged. Schäffer surfaced at noon in calm seas under a blazing Sunday. The temperature on deck was over 100 degrees, but compared to the submarine's interior, it felt cool. The crew took turns going topside in small groups. Some couldn't walk without assistance. Their muscles had atrophied from 2 months of inactivity in cramped spaces. They sat on the deck, feeling the sun, breathing clean air, remembering what it was like to be human. They stayed surfaced for 6 hours. It was an insane risk. Any passing aircraft would spot them immediately. But Schäffer had calculated that they were in a gap between air patrol zones. The Cape Verdes were Portuguese territory, neutral. The nearest Allied base was Dakar, 900 miles away. It was a gamble, but the crew needed it to survive. Later that same day, at 4:30 in the afternoon, they reached the southwest side of Branco Island in the Cape Verdes. For 4 precious hours, from 4:30 to 8:30 in the evening, the submarine anchored. The crew went swimming in the warm Atlantic waters. For men who had been trapped in a steel tube for over 2 months, the sensation of swimming in open ocean was overwhelming. Some cried, others laughed hysterically. They sang German songs on the deck, their voices carrying across the water. It was the first time many of them had smiled since leaving Norway. The American interrogation report would later note this stop with clinical precision. On 14 July 1945, the U-boat anchored for 4 hours, 16:30 to 20:30, on the southwest side of Branco, in the Cape Verdes. The crew went swimming and also sang for a while on deck. What those dry words didn't capture was the desperation, the joy, the brief return to humanity for 32 men who had been living like rats in a sewer. That evening they submerged again, but Schäffer changed tactics. They would run on the surface at night, submerging only during daylight. It was still dangerous, but less dangerous than continuing the snorkel passage. The crew's physical and mental state wouldn't survive another month underwater. On July 23rd, they crossed the equator. Naval tradition called for a celebration when crossing the equator for the first time. King Neptune would come aboard, new sailors would be initiated, but there was no celebration on U-977. They marked the occasion by eating their last can of peaches. They were in the South Atlantic now. Allied patrols were lighter here. Most anti-submarine forces were concentrated in the North Atlantic and Mediterranean, but they weren't safe. Brazilian naval forces patrolled these waters. Brazil had declared war on Germany in 1942 after U-boats sank Brazilian merchant ships. If they encountered a Brazilian warship, they would be attacked without warning. On July 27th, they saw their first ship in 2 months, a large freighter heading north, probably from Buenos Aires to West Africa. Schäffer ordered the crew to diving stations. They went deep and waited for the freighter to pass. It was a reminder that they weren't alone in the ocean. As they continued south, following the South American coast at a distance of about 300 miles, fuel became critical. They were running on fumes. Mueller had rigged a system to transfer oil from the reserve tanks to the main tanks, squeezing out every drop, but it wouldn't be enough. They needed to refuel or they would drift powerlessly in the South Atlantic until they died or were found. On August 10th, 92, days into the voyage, the engineer reported that they had less than 2 tons of fuel remaining. At their current consumption, that might last 3 days. They were still 400 miles from Mar del Plata. Schäffer reduced speed to 3 knots, barely enough to maintain steerage. The submarine wallowed in heavy seas. Half the crew was too sick to stand watch. The other half was operating on willpower alone. On August 15th, they sighted the Argentine coast, low hills rising from the sea, the mouth of the Rio de la Plata visible to the north. They had less than 500 gallons of fuel remaining, not enough to maneuver if they encountered trouble, not enough to run if they needed to escape, barely enough to reach port. On August 17th, 1945, at 7:30 in the morning, U-977 entered Mar del Plata harbour. 107 days after leaving Norway, 7,644 nautical miles, the longest voyage ever made by a German submarine. The second longest continuous submerged passage in history at 66 days. An Argentine naval vessel approached them. The officer who came aboard couldn't believe what he saw. 32 walking skeletons, men who hadn't bathed in 3 months, men whose clothes were rotting off their bodies, men who had survived what shouldn't have been survivable. Schäffer, who had lost 40 pounds during the voyage, could barely stand. He handed over his vessel to the Argentine Navy and collapsed. The arrival of U-977 caused an international sensation, a German submarine appearing in Argentina 3 months after Germany's surrender. Where had it been? What had it been doing? Immediately, rumours started. The submarine had brought Nazi gold to fund a Fourth Reich. It had carried high-ranking Nazis to safety. Some claimed Adolf Hitler himself had been aboard. The Argentine Navy seized the submarine and interned the crew. But the pressure from the United States was immediate and intense. The Americans wanted answers. Why had U-977 not surrendered? What was its mission? What had it been doing for 3 months? On August 22nd, the crew was transferred to American custody and flown to Washington for interrogation. For weeks, American intelligence officers questioned every crew member separately. They were particularly interested in the submarine's logs, which Schäffer had kept meticulously, every day's position, every mechanical problem, every decision documented. The interrogation was intense. The Americans had a detailed questionnaire. Where exactly had U-977 been on specific dates? Why hadn't they heard the repeated Allied broadcasts ordering surrender? Had they made any attacks after May 8th? Had they landed anyone on the South American coast? Had they stopped in Spain or Africa? The crew's stories were consistent. Too consistent, some interrogators thought. But the submarine's fuel consumption, records, meticulously maintained, proved their route. The amount of diesel fuel remaining, less than 500 gallons when they arrived, matched perfectly with a direct voyage from Norway. The September 19th, 1945, Office of Naval Intelligence report was comprehensive. It noted that U-977 had departed Kristiansand at 2200 hours on May 2nd, that the submarine had been ordered to attack shipping in Southampton, that 16 men had left at Holsenoy on May 10th between 0230 and 0330 hours. The report stated the submarine made for the Iceland passage on course 300 degrees, diving once on sighting a plane and once on sighting a ship. This description contradicted Schäffer's later claim of continuous submergence. The Americans found no evidence of Nazi gold, no evidence of passengers. The submarine's torpedoes were all accounted for, proving they hadn't attacked any ships after the ceasefire. The crew's story was consistent. They had fled to Argentina to avoid Soviet captivity. It was an epic voyage of survival, nothing more. But the suspicions persisted. How could a damaged Type VII submarine with worn batteries and 70% efficient engines make such a voyage? How could 32 men survive 66 days submerged? The official U.S. Navy report, issued on September 19, 1945, expressed skepticism about the 66-day submerged passage, noting that the crew had provided conflicting accounts of some details. The Brazilian Navy accused U-977 of sinking the cruiser Bahia, which had exploded and sunk on July 4, 1945, killing 336 men. The timing was suspicious. U-977 had been in the area, but investigation proved the submarine couldn't have been responsible. On July 4th, U-977 had been 600 miles away, dealing with its engine crisis. The Bahia had sunk due to an accidental ammunition explosion. The truth about the Bahia was tragic. The light cruiser, built between 1907 and 1910, had been conducting anti-aircraft gunnery practice. Crewmen were firing 20mm Oerlikon cannons at a kite being towed behind the ship. One gunner aimed too low. The shells struck depth charges stored on the Bahia's stern. The ship lacked guide rails that would have prevented the guns from being aimed at the ship itself. The explosion was catastrophic. The Bahia sank in 3 minutes. 336 sailors died, including 4 American sound technicians. Only 36 survived, floating on makeshift rafts for 4 days in shark-infested waters before being rescued by the British merchant ship Balfe. Vice Admiral Jorge Dodsworth Martins of the Brazilian Navy initially suspected U-boats. The timing seemed too coincidental. 2 German submarines appearing in Argentina just after a Brazilian warship mysteriously exploded? But the mathematics didn't work. U-530 had arrived at Mar del Plata on July 10th, just 6 days after the Bahia sank. Even at maximum speed, no submarine could have covered that distance in 6 days. As for U-977, the submarine's logs, which unlike U-530's had not been destroyed, showed it was nowhere near the Bahia when she exploded. By October 1945, the Brazilian Navy officially concluded the Bahia's loss was accidental. But the suspicion had added another layer to the conspiracy theories surrounding U-977. First, they were accused of carrying Hitler, then of sinking Allied warships after the ceasefire. The truth was simpler. They were just trying to survive. Schäffer and his crew were held in American custody for 6 months, then transferred to Britain for further interrogation. The British were particularly interested in whether U-977 had landed anyone in Norway or Ireland before heading to Argentina. Again, no evidence was found. The submarine's fuel consumption records proved it had made a direct voyage from Norway to Argentina. In 1947, Schäffer was released and returned to Germany. He found a country in ruins. His hometown of Berlin was divided between 4 occupying powers. His family's home had been destroyed in an air raid. His father had died in 1944. His mother was living in a refugee camp. The Germany he had tried to escape to Argentina to avoid seeing destroyed was gone. Most of his crew was also released by 1947. They returned to Germany to find similar devastation. The youngest crew member, the 17-year-old from Munich who had suffered psychological breakdown during the voyage, spent 2 years in psychiatric treatment. The medic who had kept the crew alive went to medical school and became a doctor. U-977 itself was towed to the United States for examination. The Navy studied the submarine extensively, particularly interested in its snorkel system and how it had managed the long submerged passage. In November 1946, the submarine was used as a target for torpedo practice off Cape Cod. It sank in 300 feet of water, its exact location lost to history. Schäffer wrote a book about the voyage in 1952. U-977, 66 Days Underwater, became an international bestseller, translated into a dozen languages, but the book only fueled more conspiracy theories. Why had Schäffer really fled to Argentina? What wasn't he telling? Every few years, a new theory would emerge. Hitler had escaped. Martin Bormann had been aboard. Nazi treasure had been hidden in Argentina. In 1953, Schäffer moved to Argentina permanently. He said he felt more at home there than in divided Germany. He worked as a businessman in Buenos Aires, married an Argentine woman, had 3 children. He rarely spoke about the voyage in his later years. When asked about the conspiracy theories, he would say, "We were young men who didn't want to die in a prison camp. That's all, nothing more." But the questions persisted. In the 1970s, several books claimed U-977 had made a secret stop in Antarctica, where a Nazi base had supposedly been established. The evidence was non-existent, but the story wouldn't die. Authors like Ladislas Chabot, who had started the Hitler escape rumors with his July 17, 1945 article in the Argentine press, continued to profit from sensational claims. In the 1990s, Russian documents allegedly proved U-977 had carried Nazi gold. The documents were forgeries, but they made headlines worldwide. What frustrated Schäffer most was that the real story, the true achievement of keeping 32 men alive during a 107-day voyage in a damaged submarine, wasn't enough for people. They wanted secrets, conspiracies, hidden, Nazi treasures. They couldn't accept that it was simply about survival. In his book, published in German in 1952 as U-977, 66 Days Underwater, Schäffer tried to set the record straight. But even his own account contained embellishments, like the claim of continuous submergence that American interrogators had found questionable. The truth was both simpler and more remarkable than any conspiracy theory. 32 men in a damaged submarine had made an impossible voyage to avoid captivity. Whether they truly stayed submerged for 66 days, as Schäffer later claimed, or surfaced regularly, as American investigators concluded, they had pushed their submarine and themselves beyond all rational limits and somehow survived. The last surviving crew member died in 2009. He was the radio operator, who had maintained the submarine's equipment despite having nothing to transmit for 3 months. In his final interview, he said he still dreamed about the voyage, the darkness at snorkel depth, the sound of water rushing past the hull, the smell of diesel and sweat and fear. "It never leaves you," he said. "Those months underwater change who you are forever." Today, the voyage of U-977 is studied in naval academies around the world, not as a model to follow, but as an example of what desperate men in desperate circumstances can achieve. Schäffer's claimed 66-day submerged passage, if true, would be one of the longest in non-nuclear submarine history. The 7,644-mile voyage on one failing engine with damaged batteries and worn-out equipment should have been impossible. Modern submarine commanders, working with computer simulations, have tried to recreate the voyage using the same parameters: fuel consumption, battery capacity, mechanical failures, weather conditions. The simulations consistently show the submarine should have run out of fuel 1,000 miles from Argentina. It should have suffered catastrophic mechanical failure. The crew should have succumbed to carbon dioxide poisoning or psychological collapse. The voyage has been studied extensively. In 1991, the Argentine Navy conducted a detailed analysis of U-977's route using the original logs. They concluded the voyage was possible, but required extraordinary seamanship and luck. The submarine had arrived with less than 500 gallons of diesel fuel remaining, perhaps 2 days of running at most economical speed. If they had encountered storms that forced them to run submerged for longer periods, if the remaining engine had failed completely, if they had been detected by any of the dozens of Allied patrols they must have passed, the story would have ended differently. What made the voyage possible wasn't just technical skill but psychological endurance. Submarine warfare was as much mental as physical. The crew lived with constant fear. Fear of detection, fear of mechanical failure, fear of running out of fuel, fear of each other. In the confined space of a Type VIIC submarine, with no privacy, no escape from the smell and heat and pressure, men could break. Some did. The unnamed sailor who tried to open the torpedo tube from inside, the ones who became catatonic from heat exhaustion, the ones who stopped eating, stopped talking, stopped responding to orders. Modern psychologists studying the voyage have noted that the crew's survival depended on maintaining routine and discipline even after the war ended, even after Germany ceased to exist as a nation. They still stood watches. They still maintained the submarine. They still followed orders from a 24-year-old commander whose authority came from a government that had surrendered. It was this adherence to structure that kept them from descending into chaos. But U-977 made it. Against every odd, against every calculation, against every reasonable expectation, 32 men in a broken submarine crossed the Atlantic and reached Argentina. They did it through a combination of skill, luck, and sheer refusal to give up. The repairs held. Schäffer's navigation was accurate. The crew maintained just enough discipline to keep functioning. The conspiracy theories will probably never die. The story of a German submarine appearing in Argentina 3 months after the war ended is too compelling. Schäffer's claim of 66 days submerged is too incredible. The survival of the crew is too unlikely. People want there to be a hidden reason, a secret mission, a darker truth. But sometimes the truth is exactly what it appears to be. Sometimes young men faced with impossible choices make impossible decisions and somehow succeed. Sometimes a broken submarine held together with piano wire and tar makes a voyage that shouldn't be possible. Sometimes 32 people refuse to accept defeat and achieve something that defies every trace expectation. Heinz Schäffer died on January 15, 1979, in Berlin. He was 57 years old. His funeral was attended by surviving crew members who had made the voyage with him 34 years earlier. They didn't speak much. Men who have shared that kind of experience don't need words. They stood by his grave, old men remembering when they were young and did something the world said couldn't be done. His gravestone bears a simple inscription. Heinz Schäffer, 1921 to 1979, Commander U-977. Nothing about the disputed 66 days submerged, nothing about the 7,000-mile voyage, nothing about the impossible escape that made history. Just a name, dates, and the number of a submarine that refused to surrender. That's how impossible voyages actually happen. Not through grand plans or secret missions, but through ordinary people refusing to accept defeat. A young commander who chose Argentina over captivity. An engineer who fixed engines with salvaged parts. A crew that stayed together when everything said they should fall apart. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.